This collapsed 1896 mine still holds its secrets, and we found one deep in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest, hidden beneath decades of forest overgrowth, collapsing timber, and the slow creep of time. There are places that the modern world has simply forgotten, places that were once alive with the sound of pickaxes, the hiss of steam, the shouts of miners, and the constant rumble of ore carts moving through narrow tunnels carved by hand into solid rock. Today, we're heading into one of those places. This mine dates to 1896. That's over 125 years ago. And when you think about what was happening in this country in 1896, it puts things into perspective. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Men were flooding into the mountains of Washington, Idaho, Montana, and beyond, chasing veins of gold, silver, copper, and lead. They built entire towns out here. They blasted through solid granite with black powder and early dynamite. They hauled timber up steep mountain faces to shore up tunnels that were barely wide enough for a single man to walk through. They lived and died in these mountains, and most of them left very little behind. But the mountain remembers, and today it's going to share a little of what it's been keeping. We're going to be honest with you right from the start. Getting to this site was not easy. The trail that once led to the mine portal has long since been reclaimed by the forest. We're talking downed timber, steep scrambles, loose shale, and at one point a creek crossing that was a lot deeper than it looked. But that's part of the deal when you come out to places like this. The harder it is to get to, the better the chances that something's still there waiting. And something was. Before we even got to the main portal, we started picking up signs of the mine's presence. The first thing you notice in any old mining area, if you know what to look for, is the change in the landscape. The terrain gets a little different. There are subtle depressions in the hillside where old workings have collapsed underneath the surface. The vegetation changes. You start seeing rust-colored staining on the rocks, where mineral-rich water has been seeping out of the mountain for over a century. Little clues that something happened here, long before any of us were born. And then, if you look closely at the forest floor, you start seeing the tailings, the waste rock, the stuff that came out of the mountain when the miners were driving their tunnels. It doesn't look like much at first glance, just a pile of rocks. But when you look at the color, the texture, the way it's been deposited in a fan shape spreading out from the hillside, you know exactly what it is. This is the mine talking to you. This is it saying, right here, I'm right here. We followed the tailings pile uphill until we hit the first timber. Just one old growth timber, still partially standing, moss-covered, leaning at a severe angle. The wood is dark and weathered, shot through with cracks, but still somehow there after all these years. Old growth timber is dense and slow to rot, and these miners knew what they were doing when they selected their shoring material. They weren't using any old scrap wood. They were using the best timber the Pacific Northwest had to offer. Behind that first timber, the hillside opens up just slightly, and you can see the ghost of the portal. The entrance to the mine is gone, completely collapsed. The overburden, that's the soil and rock above the tunnel entrance, has come down and filled everything in. You're looking at what used to be a doorway into the mountain, and now it's just a depression, a scar in the hillside, a darkening in the earth that tells you something was here. This is actually pretty common with mines of this era, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where the freeze-thaw cycle, the heavy rainfall, and the seismic activity all work together over decades to bring these portals down. The timber rots, the rock above loses its support, and gravity does the rest. It's slow, but it's relentless. Now, a collapsed portal doesn't always mean a dead mine, and this one was no exception. Off to the right of the main collapse, there was a secondary opening, not a formal portal, more like a void left by a partial collapse that hadn't fully closed in yet. It was tight, very tight. We're talking hands and knees tight, with the ceiling close enough to touch, and the walls close enough to feel on both shoulders simultaneously. Not the kind of place you want to be if you're even slightly claustrophobic, but we squeezed through, and what opened up on the other side made it worth every uncomfortable second. The tunnel beyond the squeeze was in surprisingly decent shape. Not good, we want to be clear about that, because there's no such thing as a completely safe abandoned mine, and we are not here to suggest otherwise. But the rock quality back here was clearly better than at the entrance. Harder, more competent, less fractured. The kind of rock that holds itself up even without timber support. The original miners knew this too, which is probably why there's less shoring back here. They drove into the good rock and let it do the work. The floor of the tunnel was wet, as expected. There's always water in these old workings in Washington. The mountain is saturated for most of the year, and it finds every crack, every void, every tunnel, and works its way in. Your boots get wet. You deal with it. That's the price of admission. The tunnel ran back into the hillside for what we estimated to be somewhere around 60 to 70 feet before it began to narrow and eventually pinched out. The vein they were chasing, and you could see it clearly on the ceiling and left wall, was a quartz vein with heavy copper staining. Brilliant green azurite and malachite coloring the rock in swirls and patches. It was beautiful in the way that only geology can be beautiful. Colors that shouldn't exist in a dark, wet tunnel underground. But there they are, glowing in the beam of your headlamp like something from another world. You could follow the logic of the miners just by looking at the tunnel. They came in from the portal, drove straight for a while, following the general strike of the vein, then made a slight jog to the left when the vein shifted. Standard practice. You don't drive a straight line if the ore isn't in a straight line. You follow the money, and in 1896, that money was copper. Washington's copper mining history doesn't get as much attention as the gold rushes up in the Klondike or the silver booms in Idaho, but there was serious copper activity throughout the Cascade foothills in the 1890s and early 1900s. The industrial demand for copper was exploding at this time, driven largely by the rapid electrification of American cities. Every wire, every motor, every generator needed copper, and there were men out here in these mountains willing to do brutal, dangerous, back-breaking work to pull it out of the ground. Life at a mine like this in 1896 would have been hard in ways that are genuinely difficult to comprehend today. The miners likely lived in simple wooden bunkhouses near the portal, or sometimes in tents if the operation was small enough. They worked by candlelight and later by carbide lamp. They drilled holes in the rock by hand, two-man teams, one holding the drill steel and rotating it, one swinging a hammer, and then packed those holes with black powder or early dynamite and blasted. The noise in a confined tunnel after a blast is something you just don't forget. And then they mucked out the broken rock by hand, loaded it into ore cars, and pushed those cars out to the surface on narrow-gauge rail. There was no OSHA. There were no safety regulations worth mentioning. If the mine caved in, it caved in. If a man was hurt, his partners patched him up as best they could and hoped for the best. The nearest doctor might be a day's ride away or more. These were hard men living hard lives in a hard landscape, and the mountains of Washington bear quiet witness to all of it. Back inside the tunnel, near what appeared to be the end of the main drift, we found something that stopped us cold. Tucked into a small alcove in the left wall, the kind of nook that miners sometimes carved out deliberately for storage, or that sometimes just formed naturally where the rock was weaker, there was an artifact, not a pile of cans, not a rotted timber, not a rail spike or a bolt or any of the usual hardware you find scattered through these old workings. This was a tool, intact, handle and all. We're looking at what appears to be a single jack hammer. For those who don't know, a single jack is a short-handled hammer, usually around 2 to 3 pounds in weight, used by a solo driller who holds the drill steel in one hand and strikes with the hammer in the other. It's a one-man operation, as opposed to the two-man double jack method. Single jacking was slower, but it was what you used when you were working alone or in a space too confined for two men to work side by side. The handle on this thing is still there. It's dark with age, dried out, cracked in a few places, but structurally intact. The wood is some kind of hardwood, hickory most likely, as that was the standard for hammer handles of this period. The head is heavily rusted, as you'd expect for iron that's been sitting in a wet tunnel for over a century, but the shape is still completely recognizable. This is not a piece of abstract rusted metal. This is clearly, unmistakably a hammer. Finding something like this, a complete tool, not just a fragment, not just a head without a handle, in an old mine is genuinely rare. Think about what had to happen for this to survive. The mine was abandoned, probably sometime in the early 1900s, when the copper prices dropped or the vein played out or both. Whoever left this hammer behind either forgot it or left in a hurry, or simply decided it wasn't worth carrying out. And then for over 120 years, this hammer sat in that alcove. Water came and went, the tunnel shifted and groaned, the portal collapsed, and the hammer stayed exactly where someone put it, probably the last time anyone was in this tunnel until today. There's something deeply moving about that, if you let yourself think about it. The last person to touch this hammer was a miner working in 1896 or thereabouts. He was a real human being with a life, a story, probably a family somewhere. He worked in this dark tunnel, breathing rock dust and lamp smoke, doing one of the most physically demanding jobs that existed. And the last thing he did before he left this spot for the last time was set this hammer down in this alcove. Maybe he meant to come back. Maybe he knew he wasn't coming back. Either way, he set it down, and it waited. And now here we are. We left it exactly where we found it. That's always the policy. We document, we photograph, we share, but we don't take. These artifacts belong to the mountain and to the history of this place. The moment you start pulling things out, you start erasing the story. And the story is the whole point. Coming back out through the squeeze and into the daylight, we took some time to walk the surface above the mine and look for additional features. This is always worth doing because a lot of what made a mine function happened on the surface, not underground. The ore processing, the equipment maintenance, the living quarters. All of that happened topside. We found the remnants of what was almost certainly the mine's ore chute, a wooden structure, now completely collapsed, that would have funneled broken ore from the portal area down to a lower elevation where it could be loaded onto pack animals, or if the operation was big enough, onto some kind of cart or wagon for transport down the mountain. The wood is gone, basically, just a stain in the soil and some rusted hardware, a few square-headed nails, a bolt or two. But the shape of the ground tells the story. You can see the cut in the hillside where the structure sat. Further along the slope, we found a flat area, partially artificially leveled. That was almost certainly the cabin site. Again, nothing much left. Depression here, a line of stones there that might have been a foundation corner, maybe a few pieces of glass, green tinted as old glass tends to be. The forest has done a thorough job of reclaiming this ground, but stand there long enough and you can almost feel the shape of the building that was here, the way the flat area is oriented, protected from the prevailing weather by the hillside above, positioned to give a view down the drainage. Someone picked this spot carefully. Someone thought about where they were going to live and made sensible decisions about it. That's another thing that strikes you about these old sites. The people who built them weren't stumbling around randomly. They were skilled, experienced, practical. They knew how to read terrain. They knew how to build in harsh environments. And they knew how to organize a work site efficiently with the tools and materials available. There's a real intelligence embedded in these old mining operations, and it deserves respect. On the way back down, we stopped to look at the creek that runs below the mine site. In the old records for this area, there's mention of a small arrastra, a primitive ore-grinding device that was reportedly used here in the earliest days of the operation, before any proper mill equipment arrived. An arrastra is about as low-tech as ore processing gets. Basically a circular stone track with heavy drag stones that are pulled around by animal or water power, grinding the ore into a slurry from which the minerals can be extracted. They were common in early California gold operations and made their way north with the miners who followed the rushes. But we didn't find the arrastra. If it was ever here, there's nothing left to mark the spot. But the creek is still there, still running cold and clear over mossy rocks, and it's easy to imagine what this drainage looked like in 1896 when men were working every corner of it, looking for any way to pull value out of the mountain. That's the thing about these places. The people are gone, the buildings are gone, the equipment is mostly gone, but the landscape is still essentially the same landscape those miners moved through every day. The same peaks above, the same drainage below, the same afternoon light hitting the same ridgeline at the same angle. When you're out here, you're standing in the same place they stood, looking at the same view they looked at. And that's a connection across time that you really can't get anywhere else. We'll be back out here when the snow clears in the spring to see if there's anything we missed. There's at least one more collapsed opening on the upper part of the slope that we didn't get into today, and the old records suggest there may be a lower adit somewhere along the creek that hasn't been relocated in modern times. If it's still there, we'll find it. Until then, thanks for coming along on this one. If you know anything about this mine, about its history, about who worked it, or what became of the operation, drop it in the comments. Every piece of information helps build a more complete picture of what happened here, and that picture is worth building because these places and the people who made them deserve to be remembered. We'll see you on the next one.